Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're journeying back in time to the Renaissance, a period of explosive creativity and change that spanned from the 14th to the 17th century. We often think of the stunning art of Michelangelo or the brilliant inventions of Leonardo da Vinci, but what about the words they used? And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. How did people communicate in an era that was leaving the Middle Ages behind and stepping into the modern world? Let's dive into the fascinating linguistic battle that defined the Renaissance, the struggle between the ancient giant Latin and the vibrant, rising star national languages of Europe. For over 1,000 years, Latin was the undisputed king. It was the language of the church, of scholarship, of law, and of international diplomacy. If you were an educated person anywhere from Lisbon to Prague, you read, wrote, and spoke Latin. It was the universal language that connected the intellectual elite of Europe, a legacy inherited directly from the Roman Empire. When scholars in the Middle Ages studied philosophy, theology, or science, they did so in Latin. It was the gatekeeper of knowledge, a symbol of authority and tradition. Think of it as the academic and official internet of its time, a single network that everyone of importance was plugged into. This continuity was powerful. It meant that a text written in Rome could be understood perfectly by a monk in Ireland or a professor in Poland. But, like all empires, its reign couldn't last forever. The Renaissance, which means rebirth, was all about rediscovering the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanist scholars like Petrarch, 14th century, felt that the Latin of the Middle Ages had become corrupted and clunky. They wanted to go back to the source, to the elegant classical Latin of Cicero and Virgil. This movement, known as humanism, ironically gave Latin a major boost. Suddenly, there was a renewed passion for writing in a pure classical style. Scholars hunted down ancient manuscripts, polished their grammar, and composed beautiful prose and poetry in Latin. For a time, it seemed like Latin was more powerful than ever. But this very act of purification created a problem. The new, sophisticated classical Latin was even harder for ordinary people to understand than the more functional medieval version. It became more exclusive, more of an academic exercise, while the scholars were perfecting their Latin. Something revolutionary was happening on the streets, in the markets, and in the homes of everyday people. All across Europe, local dialects and regional languages were evolving. These were the languages people actually spoke with their families and friends, what we called the vernaculars. In Italy, people spoke various forms of Italian. In France, they spoke French. In Spain, Castilian, and in England, a form of English that was beginning to resemble what we speak today. For centuries, these languages were considered common or even vulgar, not suitable for serious literature or important matters. They were the languages of the uneducated masses, or so the elite believed. But then, a few brave writers decided to challenge this idea. The first major blow to Latin's dominance came from Italy itself, with three literary giants, Dante, Alighieri, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. Dante wrote his epic poem, The Divine Comedy, not in Latin, but in his native Tuscan dialect of Italian. This was a radical move. He chose the language of the people to write one of the greatest works of Western literature, arguing that the vernacular was just as capable of expressing profound and beautiful ideas. Petrarch, though a master of classical Latin, also wrote exquisite sonnets in Italian, and Boccaccio's Decameron a collection of witty and sometimes racy stories, was written in a lively, conversational Italian that captured the spirit of the age. These writers proved that you didn't need Latin to create a masterpiece. They gave legitimacy and prestige to their national language. This trend quickly spread across Europe. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer had already paved the way with the Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, written in Middle English. By the time the Renaissance was in full swing, writers like William Shakespeare were taking the English language to incredible new heights. Shakespeare wasn't writing for a small circle of Latin-speaking scholars. He was writing for the masses who flocked to the Globe Theatre. His plays were filled with rich, inventive, and powerful English that everyone could understand and enjoy. He borrowed words from other languages, made up new ones, and showed the immense expressive power of the vernacular. Similarly, in Spain, Miguel de Cervantes wrote his masterpiece, Don Quixote, in Spanish, creating a cornerstone of modern Western literature. In France, writers like François Rabelais used the French language with incredible humor and creativity. So, why did this shift happen? A few key factors were at play. First, there was a growing sense of national identity. People started to identify more with their kingdom as French, English, or Spanish rather than as part of a single, unified Christendom. Having a national language was a powerful symbol of this new identity. Monarchs and rulers began to promote their own languages to unify their kingdoms and centralize power. They started conducting official business and law in the vernacular, pushing Latin to the side. The second, and perhaps most important, factor was the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg around 1440. This was a complete game. Before printing, books were copied by hand, a slow and expensive process. Most of these hand-copied books were in Latin, but the printing press made it possible to produce books quickly and cheaply. And what did people want to read? They wanted stories, poems, and information in the language they actually spoke. Printers, being smart business people, realized there was a huge, untapped market for books in the vernacular. The Bible was one of the first books Gutenberg printed, and the drive to translate it into national languages during the Protestant Reformation further accelerated the decline of Latin. Reformers like Martin Luther, who translated the Bible into German, wanted everyone to be able to read the Word of God for themselves, without relying on a priest to interpret the Latin text. This created a virtuous cycle. The more books that were printed in vernacular languages, the more people learned to read in their native tongue. As literacy rates rose, the demand for even more books in the vernacular grew. This process helped to standardize languages. For example, the dialect of Paris became the basis for modern French, and the dialect of London became standard English, largely because those were the centers of printing and government. So, what happened to Latin? Did it just disappear? Not at all. Latin remained the international language of science and scholarship for a long time. Isaac Newton, writing in the late 17th century, published his groundbreaking work, Principia Mathematica, in Latin, so that scientists all across Europe could read it. Universities continued to teach in Latin for centuries, but it was no longer the only language of power and knowledge. It had to share the stage with a vibrant and diverse cast of national languages. The Renaissance didn't kill Latin, it gave birth to its successors. What the Renaissance language story shows us is the power of people to shape their own culture. The rise of the vernaculars was a victory for accessibility and popular expression. It was a declaration that the thoughts, stories, and ideas of ordinary people mattered and deserved to be written down, shared, and celebrated. The world became a much richer and more colorful place. Linguistically speaking, the legacy of this shift is all around us. The very fact that you're listening to this video in English and not Latin is a direct result of the linguistic revolution that took place during the Renaissance. It was a time when new voices found their language, and in doing so, they helped create the modern world we live in today. We're diving deep into a side of the Renaissance you might not have seen before. We all know the magnificent art of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, the groundbreaking science of Copernicus, and the epic poetry of Shakespeare. But what about the humor? What about the sharp, witty, and sometimes downright savage social commentary that was bubbling just beneath the surface? That's right. We're talking about satire and parody in Renaissance literature. It's easy to think of the Renaissance as this very serious, high-minded period of rebirth and classical revival. And it was, but the people living back then were just like us. They had frustrations. They saw absurdity in the world around them, and they loved a good laugh. Satire became one of their most powerful tools to critique society without, getting thrown in a dungeon or worse. It was a way to poke the bear without getting mauled. So what were they? Pretty much everything. The biggest target, without a doubt, was the church. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the church had accumulated immense wealth and power, and with that came corruption. You had clergy living lavish lifestyles, selling indulgences, basically get out of purgatory free, constant, often failing to practice what they preached. This didn't go unnoticed. One of the earliest and most brilliant examples of this is The Praise of Folly by the Dutch humanist Desiderius, published in 1511. This book is a masterpiece of satire. It's written from the perspective of Folly herself, personified as a goddess, who goes on a hilarious rant about how she rules the world. She argues that everyone, from kings and popes down to scholars and merchants, is indebted to her. Theologians, she says, get tangled in ridiculous, hair-splitting debates. Monks follow meaningless rituals while ignoring true piety. Popes are more concerned with war and wealth than with the spiritual well-being of their flock. By having Folly praise these things, Erasmus was actually holding up a mirror to the absurdity and hypocrisy of the institution. It was a clever way to criticize the church from within, using humor as a shield. The book was a massive bestseller, which shows you just how much its message resonated with people across Europe. Then we have François Rabelais in France, with his larger-than-life series of novels, Gargantua and Pantagruel. If Erasmus was using a rapier, Rabelais was wielding a giant comical club. These books are wild, filled with giants, scatological humor, and outrageous adventure. On the surface, it's just a funny story about a father and son giant duo. But beneath all the bawdy jokes and feasting, Rabelais is launching a full-scale assault on the stuffy, outdated educational systems of his day. The pointless wars waged by petty tyrants and the dogmatic intolerance of religious authorities. He champions a more humanistic approach to life, one that celebrates knowledge, freedom, and, enjoying a good meal and a bottle of wine. His work is a perfect example of how parody can be used to tear down old structures and imagine a better, more enlightened world. Of course, we couldn't talk about the Renaissance without mentioning Spain and its most famous literary creation, Don Quixote, by Miguel de F, published in the early 17th century. This novel is often called the first modern novel, and it's a brilliant parody of the chivalric romances that were wildly popular at the time. These were stories about knights in shining armor, rescuing damsels in distress and slaying dragons. Cervantes saw how silly and out of touch these tales had become. So he creates Alonso Quijano, a nobleman who reads so many of these books that he loses his mind and decides to become a knight-errant himself, renaming himself Don Quixote. He gets a rusty suit of armor, recruits a down-to-earth farmer, Sancho Panza, and rides off on his old horse Rocinante to right the wrongs of the world. The comedy comes from the clash between Quixote's fantasy and the harsh, mundane reality. He famously attacks windmills, believing them to be giants. He sees a peasant girl and imagines her as the beautiful Princess Dulcinea. Through these hilarious misadventures, Cervantes isn't just making fun of romance novels. He's exploring deeper themes about idealism versus reality, sanity versus madness, and the very nature of truth itself. Don Quixote is a parody, yes, but it's a parody with a huge heart and incredible depth. And what about England? The English Renaissance, especially the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods, was a hotbed of satire. Playwrights were all over it. Ben Jonson, a contemporary and rival of Shakespeare, was a master of the comedy of humors. His plays, like Volpone or The Alchemist, are populated by characters who are each driven by a single, overwhelming obsession or humor, usually greed, lust, or vanity. In Volpone, a rich Venetian nobleman pretends to be on his deathbed to trick a group of legacy hunters into giving him expensive gifts, each hoping to be named his heir. It's a scathing and hilarious critique of the greed and moral decay Jonson saw in London society. Even Shakespeare, while known for his grand tragedies and romantic comedies, had a sharp, satirical edge. Think about the character of Malvolio in Twelfth Night. He's a pompous, self-righteous steward who is tricked into believing his mistress Olivia is in love with him. The prank they pull on him, convincing him to wear yellow stockings and is pure comedic gold. But it's also a satire of puritanical self-love and social climbing. Shakespeare uses characters like Malvolio or the buffoonish Constable Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing to poke fun at human vanity and incompetence. So why was satire so important during this period? The Renaissance was a time of immense change and upheaval. The invention of the printing press meant ideas and criticisms could spread faster than ever before. The rise of humanism placed a new emphasis on individual reason and experience, encouraging people to question authority rather than just blindly accept it. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the monolithic power of the Catholic Church. In this turbulent environment, satire and parody were the perfect vehicles for navigating change. They allowed writers to question the status quo, to expose corruption, and to challenge old ways of thinking in a way that was engaging, entertaining, and, most importantly, less likely to get them executed. By cloaking their critiques in humor, these authors could say they could make powerful points about religion, politics, and social norms while still delighting their audience. These works weren't just funny, they were brave. They helped shape public opinion, fueled intellectual debate, and pushed society forward. So, the next time you think of the Renaissance, don't just picture marble statues and solemn portraits. Remember the laughter. Remember the biting wit of Erasmus, the boisterous comedy of Rabelais, the brilliant parody of Cervantes, and the sharp social commentary of Jonson and Shakespeare. They show us that humor has always been one of humanity's most essential and powerful tools for understanding ourselves and changing the world. Have you ever wondered why we talk about love the way we do? Why we use metaphors like being struck by Cupid's arrow or describe a lover's eyes as stars. A lot of these ideas that feel so timeless actually have roots in a specific, vibrant period of history. The Renaissance, from the 14th to the 17th century, Europe underwent a massive cultural rebirth, and with it came a whole new way of thinking, writing, and feeling about love. We're going to journey back in time to explore the passionate, complex, and often contradictory world of love in Renaissance literature. So, what was love like before the Renaissance? In the medieval period, the dominant idea was courtly love. This was a very formal, almost ritualistic kind of love. A knight would devote himself to a noble lady, often one who was already married and completely unattainable. He would perform great deeds in her name, write her poetry, and suffer beautifully from a distance. It was all about chivalry, service, and a kind of spiritual devotion. The physical consummation of this love was usually off the table. It was more of a game of idealized longing than a real, tangible relationship. Then the Renaissance happened. Thinkers and artists started looking back, not just to the medieval period, but further to the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome. They rediscovered the works of philosophers like Plato, and this had a huge impact on how they saw love. Suddenly, love wasn't just about distant, chivalrous pining. A new idea, Neoplatonism, took hold, and it was a game. Neoplatonism proposed a kind of ladder of love. The idea was that love begins with the physical attraction to a beautiful person. But you don't stop there. That initial attraction is just the first rung. By contemplating your beloved's physical beauty, you can ascend to appreciate their inner beauty, the beauty of their mind and soul. And from there, you can ascend even higher to an appreciation of universal, divine beauty and goodness. Love became a spiritual journey, a pathway to God. It connected the earthly and the divine, the physical and the spiritual. This was a radical shift. One of the first and most important figures to capture this new spirit was the Italian poet His collection of poems, the Canzoniere, written for his beloved Laura, became the blueprint for love poetry for centuries. Petrarch met Laura once in a church, and she was his muse for the rest of his life. He was totally obsessed, but his love wasn't the old-style courtly pining. It was a deeply personal, psychological roller coaster. In his sonnets, Petrarch is constantly torn. He describes Laura in divine terms: her golden hair, her starry eyes, her angelic presence. She is his guide to heaven. But at the same time, he's tormented by his very real, very human desire for her. He's caught in a paradox. His love for her is a source of spiritual enlightenment, but it's also a source of intense personal suffering. He famously wrote of icy fire and living death, capturing the conflicting emotions of hope and despair, pleasure and pain. This Petrarchan conceit, the use of elaborate, often contradictory metaphors, describe a lover's beauty and the lover's pain, became the dominant style. Everyone wanted to write like Petrarch, and they did. This style spread like wildfire across Europe. In England, poets like Sir Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey brought the sonnet form and Petrarch's themes to a new audience. They translated his work, and then they started writing their own versions, adapting it to their own experiences. Love poetry became the ultimate way for an educated gentleman to show off his wit, his learning, and his emotional depth. But as the Renaissance progressed, writers started to play with and even push back against these conventions. And nobody did that better than William Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote a sequence of 154 sonnets. But he wasn't just copying, he was turning the whole tradition on its head. For one, his sonnets aren't just about one idealize unattainable woman. The first 126 are addressed to a beautiful young man, the fair youth, urging him to marry and have children so his beauty won't die. This was a radical departure, exploring themes of male friendship, mentorship, and a love that transcends simple romance. Then the focus shifts to the Dark Lady, and she is the complete opposite of Petrarch's angelic Laura. In his famous Sonnet 130, Shakespeare mocks the old cliches. He writes, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red." He says her hair is like black wires and her breath reeks. It sounds like an insult, but it's not. The punchline of the poem is, "And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare." He's saying, my love is real. She's a real woman, not some impossible goddess. And I love her for who she is, flaws and all. Shakespeare was bringing love poetry back down to earth, injecting it with a dose of realism and psychological complexity that felt fresh and new. And it wasn't just in poetry. Love in Renaissance prose and drama was just as revolutionary. Think about Romeo and Juliet. Their love is a whirlwind. It's not a slow, contemplative journey up the ladder of love. It's passionate, impulsive, and it's a force of nature that defies their families, their society, and ultimately their fate. While it ends in tragedy, Shakespeare presents their love as something intensely pure and powerful, a rebellion against the hatred of the world around them. The comedies, too, are filled with explorations of love. In Plays Like A Midsummer Night's Dream, love is a chaotic, magical, and often ridiculous force. Characters fall in and out of love at the drop of a magical flower's juice, highlighting how fickle and irrational our affections can be. In Much Ado About Nothing, we see the merry war between Beatrice and Benedict. They trade witty insults and swear they'll never fall in love, but everyone else can see they're perfect for each other. Their journey is about overcoming their own pride and prejudice to admit their true feelings. Shakespeare showed that love wasn't just one thing. It could be tragic, comic, magical, intellectual, and deeply, deeply human. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? The Renaissance completely redefined our cultural understanding of love. It took the formal, distant ideal of courtly love and infused it with classical philosophy, personal psychology, and a healthy dose of realism. Writers from Petrarch to Shakespeare created a new language for love, one filled with soaring ideals, but also grounded in the messy, contradictory reality of human experience. They gave us the idea of love as a transformative spiritual journey, but also as a passionate earthly force. They created the tropes of the angelic beloved and the suffering poet, only to have later writers cleverly subvert them. The next time you hear a love song on the radio that talks about a loveress' heavenly eyes or the pain of being apart, you can trace that idea back through the centuries to a poet in Italy, tormented by his love for Laura, or a playwright in London mocking those very same cliches to declare a more realistic, more powerful kind of love. The Renaissance conversation about love is one we're still having today. It's a legacy written in sonnets and staged in tragedies and comedies, a legacy that continues to shape the very words we use to describe one of life's most profound experiences. Now, we're swapping our modern passports for parchment and ink to journey back in time. We're diving into the fascinating world of Renaissance, the original travel blogs from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Forget curated Instagram feeds. These were raw, personal, and often perilous accounts of a world that was rapidly expanding in the European imagination. So, Why was everyone suddenly on the move during the Renaissance? Well, a few key things were happening. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 disrupted traditional trade routes to the east, pushing explorers to find new seas. This curiosity was supercharged by the humanist spirit of the age, a fervent desire to learn, to see, and to understand the world through direct experience, not just through ancient texts. Plus, the invention of the printing press meant that for the first time, these incredible stories could be shared far and wide, inspiring even more people to pack their bags. Travel back then was no luxury vacation. It was tough. Roads were often just dirt tracks, and travelers faced the constant threat of bandits, disease, and shipwreck. Imagine spending months on a cramped, creaking wooden ship with a diet of hardtack and salted meat, not knowing if you'd ever see home again. Yet, this didn't stop our intrepid authors. Their motivations were as varied as their destinations. Some were merchants seeking fortune, like the Venetian traders who followed the old Silk Road. Others were diplomats on sensitive missions, trying to forge alliances in foreign courts. Many were pilgrims undertaking spiritually significant journeys to holy sites like Jerusalem or Rome. And, of course, there were the explorers, driven by a thirst for discovery and fame, sailing into the unknown. Let's start with a name many of you might know, but perhaps in a different context. Niccolo de Conti, a Venetian merchant. He spent a staggering 25 years traveling through Asia in the early 15th century. His journey is a real-life epic. He traveled through Syria, Persia, and then sailed to India, exploring its western coast. He didn't stop there. He ventured into Southeast Asia, visiting places like Sumatra and Java, and even reached what is now Madanda, Vietnam. When he finally returned to Venice, his stories were so incredible that the papal secretary, Poggio Bracciolini, wrote them all down. Conti's accounts gave Europeans some of their first detailed, first-hand descriptions of places like the Ganges River, the practice of sati in India, and the rich spice trade of the Malay archipelago. His work became a primary source for cartographers, helping to literally redraw the map of the known world. Now, let's talk about someone who traveled not for profit, but for piety. Marjorie Kemp, an English mystic from the early 15th century, gives us a uniquely female perspective on travel. Her work, The Book of Marjorie Kemp, is often considered the first autobiography in the English language. It details her extensive pilgrimages across Europe and to the Holy Land. Her journey was deeply emotional and spiritual. She describes her ecstatic visions and her intense, often public, displays of weeping. Traveling as a woman, especially one who was so openly devout and unconventional, was incredibly challenging. She faced suspicion, was accused of heresy, and was even imprisoned. Yet, her book provides an invaluable look into the life of a medieval laywoman and a profound spiritual drive that could compel someone to undertake such an arduous journey. It's a powerful reminder that exploration isn't just about geography. It's also about the inner landscapes of faith and self-discovery. As the Renaissance progressed, so did the age of exploration. Inter Ludovico di Vartema, an Italian adventurer with an insatiable curiosity. Around the turn of the 16th century, he decided he wanted to see the world. And boy, did he! He learned Arabic, disguised himself as a Muslim, and managed to become one of the first non-Muslim Europeans to enter the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. Think about the immense risk involved in that. His detailed descriptions of the Hajj pilgrimage were groundbreaking for European audiences. From there, he traveled through Persia, India, and the Spice Islands, He was a keen observer, documenting everything from the military tactics of the Mamluk Sultanate to the social customs of Indian kingdoms and the lucrative spice trade in the. His book, Itinerario, was an instant bestseller, translated into multiple languages. Varthama was the ultimate adventurer, a man who didn't just observe cultures from a distance, but immersed himself in them, even at great personal risk. These travelogues weren't just adventure stories. They were powerful tools of knowledge. They were filled with practical information that was vital for trade, diplomacy, and cartography. Authors would describe local currencies, the prices of goods, political structures, and military strengths. They'd note the safe harbors, the dangerous currents, and the best overland routes. For mapmakers like From Moreau, who created his famous world map in the mid-15th century, the accounts of travelers like Niccolo de Conti were indispensable. These first-hand reports allowed them to move beyond the mythological geographer of the Middle Ages and create maps that were more accurate, detailed, and useful. The travelogues effectively became the raw data that fueled the geographic revolution of the Renaissance. But what I find most captivating is how these writers grappled with cultural differences. When they encountered societies with different customs, religions, and social norms, their reactions were complex. Sometimes you see a genuine sense of wonder and admiration. They might praise the sophisticated architecture of a foreign city or the hospitality of a people. At other times, you see a clear Eurocentric bias, judging everything against the standards of Christian Europe. They might describe other cultures as barbaric or pagan. This clash of perspectives is what makes these texts so rich. They are not just windows into other worlds, but also mirrors reflecting the mindset, the prejudices, and the evolving worldview of Renaissance Europe. They show us people trying to make sense of a world that was suddenly much larger and more complex than they had ever imagined. As we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, the nature of travel writing starts to shift again. With the colonization of the Americas, a new wave of travelogues emerged, written by conquistadors, missionaries, and colonial administrators. These texts, like the letters of Hernan Cortes or the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas, are deeply intertwined with the project of empire. They often serve to justify conquest, to report on the resources of the new territories, or to debate the very humanity of the indigenous peoples. Los Casuses, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, for example, is a horrifying and passionate denunciation of the atrocities committed by the Spanish colonists. It is a powerful piece of protest literature that used the format of a report or travelogue to expose injustice. This shows how the genre evolved to tackle the new political and moral complexities of the age. So, what is the lasting legacy of these Renaissance? They did more than just entertain and inform. They fundamentally changed how Europeans saw themselves and their place in the world. They shattered old myths and replaced them with complex and often contradictory first-hand accounts. They fueled an appetite for the exotic and the unknown that would drive exploration and trade for centuries to come. They were the raw material for epic poems, plays, and novels, shaping the literary imagination of the era. And most importantly, they left us with these incredibly human documents. In their pages, we hear the voices of real people, brave, flawed, curious, and resilient, who stepped out into a wider world and tried to write it all down. They are the pioneers of travel writing, and their stories continue to inspire us to explore, to question, and to see the world with fresh eyes. We're going to time travel back to the Renaissance, not just to look at the breathtaking art, but to read the mail. That's right, We re-diving into the letters exchanged between the great masters and the powerful patrons who commissioned their work. These letters are like a secret window into their world, revealing the ambitions, the anxieties, and the very human negotiations behind some of history's greatest masterpieces. Forget the stuffy art history textbooks for a moment. This is the real drama, the real relationships, and the real business of art. So, let's set the scene. It's the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries in Italy. If you were a wealthy merchant, a powerful duke, or even the Pope, one of the best ways to show off your status, piety, and intellect was to hire the best artists around. But this wasn't like ordering something online. There was no add to cart for a fresco. It was a complex, personal, and often years-long relationship, all managed through the power of the written word. These letters weren't just simple notes. They were legally binding contracts, progress reports, and sometimes very personal pleas. Let's start with a big one: Michelangelo and the Pope, specifically Pope Julius II. Their relationship was legendary for being stormy. Julius was an ambitious and impatient patron, and Michelangelo was a fiercely proud and often stubborn artist. When Julius commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, it was a project of epic proportions. The letters between them and their intermediaries tell a story of constant struggle. We see Michelangelo complaining about late payments, which were a constant source of stress. He wrote about his physical suffering, working on his back for 4 years, with paint dripping into his eyes. He famously wrote a poem about it, saying his beard turns up to heaven and his spine is all crumpled. But the letters also show his fierce dedication. He fought against the Pope's initial idea for a simple design of the 12 apostles, insisting on the complex biblical narrative we see today. He wrote, "This is a poor thing," about the original plan, boldly arguing for his own grander vision. This back and forth, this clash of two colossal egos, is all documented in their correspondences. It shows us that creating a masterpiece wasn't a serene, divine process. It was a negotiation, a fight for artistic control, and it's what makes the final result even more incredible. Now, let's move from Rome to Florence and a different kind of relationship. Let's talk about Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua. She was one of the most influential art patrons of the Renaissance, a true connoisseur. Her letters are a masterclass in how to manage artists. She was incredibly specific, demanding, and persistent. She had a vision for her private study, her studiolo, and she wanted it filled with paintings by the greatest artists of the day, all based on specific allegorical themes. Her correspondence with Perudino, the teacher of Raphael, is fascinating. She sent him incredibly detailed instructions for a painting, the battle between love and chastity. She described the exact scene, the characters, their poses, and even the landscape. It was like a script for a movie. Perugino wrote back, trying to negotiate some creative freedom, but Isabella was firm. She replied, "Essentially, stick to the plan." The letters reveal her as a micromanager, but also as someone with a clear artistic program. She wasn't just buying art. She was co-creating it through her detailed instructions. This shows a completely different dynamic, the patron as the director and the artist as the highly skilled executor of a vision. But what happened when things went wrong? Let's look at Leonardo da Vinci. He was notorious for being a perfectionist and, well, a procrastinator. His patrons often found themselves writing desperate letters, asking where their paintings were. The monks of San Donato, Escupito, commissioned the adoration of the Magi from him. Years went by and all they had was a stunning but unfinished under their letters show growing frustration and legal threats, trying to get Leonardo to finish the work or return the advance. He never did finish it. This correspondence paints a picture of Leonardo as a genius who was often unreliable, his mind already leaping to the next scientific problem or artistic challenge, leaving a trail of frustrated clients and unfinished masterpieces in his wake. It's a very human side of the divine Leonardo. The letters also revealed the financial side of art. Artists weren't just starving, they were running businesses. They had to negotiate for every ducat. Benvenuto Cellini, a goldsmith and sculptor, wrote a famous autobiography filled with stories of his dealings with patrons. His letters are brash, confident, and always focused on getting paid what he believed he was worth. He would write to Duke Cosimo I de' Medici, flattering him but also reminding him of the costs of bronze, the wages for his assistants, and, of course, the value of his own unique genius. He once got into a heated argument with the Duchess, who tried to lowball him for his sculpture of Perseus. His written accounts of these confrontations are priceless. They demystify the art world and show us the nitty-gritty negotiations that were a constant part of an artist's life. These letters also served as a kind of resume. When an artist moved to a new city, they would write letters of introduction to potential patrons. In one of the most famous examples, a young Leonardo da Vinci wrote to the Duke of Milan, Ludovic. What's amazing is that in this long letter, he barely mentions his painting skills. He spends most of the letter marketing himself as a brilliant military engineer. He lists all the incredible war machines he can design: portable bridges, cannons, armored vehicles. It's only at the very end that he casually adds, likewise in painting, I can do everything possible. This letter is a brilliant piece of self-promotion. Leonardo knew his audience. He understood that the Duke of Milan was more concerned with warfare than art, so he tailored his pitch perfectly. He got the job, and it was in Milan that he painted The Last Supper. So what do all these letters tell us? They show that the Renaissance masterpieces we revere weren't created in a vacuum. They were the product of complex human relationships. There was collaboration, conflict, negotiation, and a constant flow of communication. The patrons weren't just writing checks, they were partners, critics, and often the primary visionaries. The artists weren't just solitary geniuses. They were entrepreneurs, project managers, and skilled negotiators who had to manage expectations, budgets, and deadlines. Reading their private correspondence bridges the 500-year gap and makes these historical giants feel incredibly real and relatable. We feel Michelangelo's frustration, Isabella d'Este's determination, and Leonardo's distracted brilliance. It adds such a rich layer of understanding to the art itself. The next time you look at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you can imagine the tense letters flying back and forth between Rome and Florence. It proves that behind every great work of art, there's a great story. And sometimes, the best place to find that story is in the mail. Now, we're stepping back in time to the Renaissance, an era bursting with artistic genius. We all know the names: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. Their masterpieces have captivated the world for centuries. But behind the beautiful canvases and breathtaking sculptures, there are stories that are a little darker, a little stranger, and a whole lot more mysterious than what you learned in art history class. That's right, we're diving into the juicy and sometimes downright spooky urban legends of the Renaissance masters. Are these tales true? Are they just elaborate rumors that have snowballed over time? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So grab your popcorn, because things are about to get weird. First up, let's talk about the ultimate Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci. We know him as the painter of the Mona Lisa, the inventor of flying machines, and a brilliant anatomist. But legend has it that Leonardo's quest for knowledge took him to some very dark places. The most persistent rumor that he was a grave robber. It's said that to perfect his understanding of the human body, Leonardo couldn't just rely on dusty old medical texts. He needed to see it for himself. So, under the cloak of darkness, he would sneak into cemeteries and morgues, illegally exhuming bodies to dissect them in his secret workshop. While it is true that Leonardo performed dissections, his anatomical drawings are proof of that the practice was heavily restricted and controlled by the church and universities. He did receive special permissions to dissect some bodies, often those of executed criminals. But the image of him, shovel in hand, digging up graves by moonlight, that's likely a dramatic embellishment, a legend born from the public's awe and suspicion of his almost supernatural intellect. It paints a picture of a man so obsessed with his work that he defied both law and religion. A narrative far more thrilling than just getting a permission slip. Next, we journey from Florence to Rome, to the hallowed halls of the Sistine Chapel, and into the world of the famously temperamental Michelangelo. His feud with Pope Julius II is the stuff of historical fact, a clash of two colossal egos. But one legend takes this rivalry to a whole new level. As the story goes, Michelangelo was so frustrated with the constant meddling and criticism from the Pope that he decided to get some petty revenge. If you look closely at the Last Judgment fresco, you'll find the figure of Minos, the judge of the underworld, with donkey ears. And who was the model for this damnable soul wrapped in the coils of a serpent? None other than Biagio da Cesena, the Pope's own master of ceremonies, who had complained that the fresco was more fit for a public tavern than a sacred chapel. When Biagio complained to the Pope, Julius II supposedly just shrugged and said, "My jurisdiction does not extend to hell, so the portrait will have to stay." Now, this part is actually true, but the legend deepens. It's whispered that Michelangelo didn't stop there. Some claim he hid a caricature of the Pope himself somewhere in the massive scene, a subtle but eternal insult. Art historians have searched for centuries, but no definitive Poppy portrait has been found. Is it a hidden masterpiece of revenge, or just a rumor fueled by Michelangelo's well-known rebellious spirit? The mystery remains. Now, let's talk about Raphael, often seen as the gentler, more serene of the great trio. His art is known for its harmony, grace, and beauty, but his legend is one of passion, not piety. The story revolves around his most famous muse, a woman known as La Fornarina, or the baker's daughter. Her real name was Margherita Lute, and she was, by all accounts, the love of Raphael's life. He painted her over and over again, and their love was an open secret in Rome. The legend claims that Raphael's passion for Margherita was so all-consuming that it ultimately led to his early death at just 37 years old. The 16th century biographer Giorgio Vasari wrote that Raphael died from an excess of amorous pleasures. Basically, the legend says he died from too much love. After a particularly long night with Margherita, he developed a fever, and when doctors tried to treat him, he was too embarrassed to tell them the true cause of his exhaustion. They treated him for the wrong ailment, and he quickly passed away. While the official cause of death was likely a fever from an infectious disease like malaria, the story of him dying from passion is far more romantic and tragic. It transforms him from a victim of illness into a martyr for love, a legend that has clung to his name for 500 years. Let's move on to a painter whose life was as dramatic and violent as his art. This guy was the original bad boy of the art world. He was constantly getting into brawls. He was wanted for murder, and he was always on the run. His paintings are famous for their intense realism and dramatic use of light and shadow, a style called ki. But one of the darkest legends about him concerns how he achieved that realism. Rumor has it that for his painting, The Death of the Virgin, Caravaggio needed a model for the deceased Mary, but he couldn't find a living person who could realistically portray the pallor and stillness of death. So what did he do? According to the legend, he went down to the Tiber River and pulled the body of a drowned woman from the water, using her bloated corpse as his model. This caused a massive scandal. The church who commissioned the painting was horrified and rejected it, not just for the theological implications of showing Mary as a real dead woman, but because of the horrific rumor of its creation. While there's no concrete proof, Caravaggio used an actual corpse. His depiction of the Virgin Mary was so shockingly realistic and unidealized for the time that it is easy to see how such a gruesome story could take root. It speaks to his reputation as an artist who would do anything, absolutely anything, for his art. Our next tale involves the Flemish master, Peter Bruegel the Elder, famous for his detailed landscapes and scenes of peasant life. His paintings are like a Where's Waldo of the 16th century, filled with hundreds of tiny figures going about their daily lives. But one of his most famous works, The Fall of the Rebel Angels, is said to hold a bizarre secret. The painting is a chaotic whirlwind of angels battling monstrous, hybrid demons falling from heaven. It's a visual feast of the grotesque and the strange. The legend says that Bruegel didn't just invent these creatures from his imagination. Instead, it's whispered that he owned a secret book, a demonic bestiary or a grimoire, filled with illustrations of real demons and creatures from hell. He supposedly copied the creatures for his painting directly from this forbidden text. Some even said he made a pact to gain access to these visions. This legend taps into the deep-seated fears of the time, a period when belief in demons, witchcraft, and the supernatural was very real. Bruegel's creations were so bizarre, so unlike anything seen before, that people couldn't believe they came from a human mind alone. They had to come from a darker, more sinister source. The idea that his masterpiece is actually a page from a real-life demon encyclopedia is a chilling thought that adds a layer of horror to an already unsettling painting. Finally, let's talk about the strange case of Parmigianino, a talented painter known for his elegant, elongated figures. His most famous work is probably the Madonna with the long neck. But his career took a strange turn. According to his contemporary, Giorgio Vasari, Parmigianino became obsessed with alchemy. He abandoned his painting commissions, neglected his work, and spent all his time and money trying to turn base metals into gold. His appearance grew wild and unkempt, a savage or hermit instead of a refined artist. The legend says his obsession wasn't just about getting rich. He believed he could create new magical pigments through alchemy that would revolutionize painting, colors that would shine with an otherworldly light. He was chasing an artistic holy grail. He squandered his fortune, ruined his health, and died in poverty and disgrace, a cautionary tale against forsaking one's true gift for a fool's errand. While his interest in alchemy is historically documented, the legend frames it as a complete descent into madness, a tragic story of a genius who flew too close to the sun, trading his paintbrush for a crucible and losing everything in the process. So, from grave-robbing geniuses and vengeful masters to passionate lovers and demon-scribbling painters, the Renaissance was clearly not just about serene Madonnas and Stoic portraits. These urban legends, whether true or false, reveal our fascination with the line between genius and madness. They show us that behind the divine beauty of the art, there were deeply human, flawed, and passionate individuals. These stories have survived for centuries because they make these larger-than-life figures feel more real, more accessible, and infinitely more interesting. What do you think? Are there any other painterly legends you've heard? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Now, we're journeying back in time to the heart of the Renaissance, a period of incredible artistic and intellectual rebirth. But what if I told you that one of the most powerful sparks for this explosion of creativity came from a man who lived just before it truly began? We're talking about Dante Alighieri, the Florentine poet whose masterpiece, the Divine Comedy, didn't just define an era, it shaped the future of literature for centuries to come. So, how exactly did a 14th century poem become a blueprint for some of the greatest writers in history? Let's dive in and explore the profound and lasting influence of Dante. Before we see how Dante's work rippled through time, we need to understand why it was so groundbreaking in the first place. Picture this. It's the early 1300s. Most serious literature is written in Latin, accessible only to the clergy and the highly educated elite. Then comes Dante, who decides to write his epic journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, not in Latin, but in the everyday Italian vernacular spoken by the people of Florence. This was a revolutionary act. He essentially elevated the common tongue to a language of high art, proving that it was just as capable of expressing complex theology, profound emotion, and epic storytelling as Latin was. This decision alone democratized literature and laid the foundation for a unified Italian language. It was a clear message. The stories and ideas of the people matter. Now, let's fast forward a little to the full swing of the Italian Renaissance. Two of the biggest names you'll hear are Petrarch and Boccaccio. They, along with Dante, are often called the three crowns of Italian literature. Petrarch, known as the father of humanism, deeply admired Dante. While he sometimes had a bit of a friendly rivalry, he recognized Dante's genius in using the vernacular. Petrarch's own work, especially his famous sonnets, built upon the emotional depth and personal introspection that Dante had pioneered. He saw how Dante used personal experiences, love for Beatrice, his political exile to fuel universal themes. Then there's Boccaccio, who was an absolute super. He wrote a biography of Dante and even gave public lectures on the Divine Comedy. Boccaccio's most famous work, the Decameron, is a collection of tales told by a group of young people sheltering from the Black Death. While its tone is much earthier and more human-centric than Dante's, you can see the influence, the structured narrative, the use of vernacular to capture the voices of different social classes, and the exploration of human nature. All these elements echo the path Dante forged. Boccaccio essentially took Dante's divine framework and applied it to the messy, beautiful, and often hilarious world of everyday human life. As the Renaissance spread from Italy across the rest of Europe, so did Dante's influence. Let's hop over to England and look at Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English literature. Chaucer's masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales, owes a huge debt to Dante. Like Dante, Chaucer chose to write in the language of the people, Middle English instead of French or Latin, which were the languages of the court and the church. The very structure of the Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by a diverse group of pilgrims on a journey, mirrors the journey motif of the Divine Comedy. Some scholars even point to specific scenes and characters in Chaucer's work that seem to be direct nods to Dante, like the House of Fame, which has a very Dantesque allegorical feel. Chaucer showed that English, like Dante's Italian, could be a vehicle for great art, but the influence doesn't stop in the 14th century. Let's move into the 16th and 17th centuries. Who's the biggest name in English literature from that period? William Shakespeare. Of course, while direct links are harder to trace, the intellectual climate Shakespeare worked in was one that had been shaped by Renaissance humanism, a movement Dante helped inspire. The focus on the individual, the complexity of human morality, the interplay of fate and free will vs are themes that run through both Dante's and Shakespeare's works. Both writers created characters that feel incredibly real and psychologically complex, wrestling with love, betrayal, ambition, and despair. Dante gave us the tormented souls in the Inferno. Shakespeare gave us Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear. Both plumbed the depths of the human condition. And then there's John Milton, whose epic poem Paradise Lost is perhaps the most direct English-language successor to the Divine Comedy. Milton, a devout Puritan, set out to justify the ways of God to men, a goal very similar to Dante's own theological exploration. The sheer scale and ambition of Paradise Lost describing the war in heaven, the fall of Satan, and the creation of humanity is epic in a way that had few precedents other than Dante. Milton's depiction of hell, with its fiery lakes and legions of fallen angels, is clearly inspired by the vivid and terrifying imagery of Dante's Inferno. Satan, as a charismatic, defiant, and tragic anti-hero, is a character of a complexity that feels born from the same tradition that gave us Dante's memorable Sinners. Milton took Dante's epic structure and theological weight and reforged it in the furnace of the English Reformation. Beyond the literary giants, Dante's influence seeped into the visual arts as well. Think of Sandro Botticelli's famous illustrations of the Divine Comedy, or Michelangelo's The Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, which is filled with muscular, tormented figures that could have been lifted directly from the pages of the Inferno. Artists were captivated by the powerful, dramatic, and intensely visual world Dante had created. His words painted pictures so vivid that artists for generations felt compelled to bring them to life on canvas and in stone. He didn't just give writers a new language, he gave artists a new universe to explore. So why was Dante's influence so powerful and so long? I think it comes down to a few key things. First, universality. His journey is an allegory for every human life, a struggle from a dark place towards understanding, redemption, and a higher truth. It doesn't matter what century you live in. That's a relatable story. Second, his psychological insight. The characters in the Inferno aren't just names in a list of sinners. They are fully formed individuals, trapped by their own choices and flaws. We feel their pain, their regret, their defiance. Dante understood human nature in a way that feels incredibly modern. And finally, his sheer imaginative power. He didn't just write about hell, he mapped it. He gave it geography, laws, and a population of unforgettable characters. He created a complete, self-contained universe that was terrifying, beautiful, and utterly believable. This act of world-building was a monumental achievement that gave later writers the permission to dream on an equally epic scale. In the end, Dante Alighieri was more than just a poet. He was a pioneer, a trailblazer, and a visionary. By writing his soul's journey in the language of his people, he unlocked the potential of modern European literature, from Petrarch and Boccaccio's humanism to Chaucer's English pilgrimage to Milton's cosmic war. His footprints are everywhere. He taught writers that the most personal stories can be the most universal, that the language of the street can carry the weight of divine truth, and that the human imagination has no limits. The Divine Comedy isn't just a cornerstone of the Renaissance, it's a living work that continues to inspire artists, thinkers, and dreamers to this day. If you've ever wondered why stories about Zeus, Hercules, and Aphrodite are still so famous today, a big part of the answer lies in a period of incredible artistic and intellectual rebirth. The Renaissance, this era, stretching from the 14th to the 17th century, didn't just rediscover ancient Greek and Roman texts. It completely reimagined them. So we're diving deep into how the Renaissance took the epic myths of ancient Greece and gave them a brand new life. Let's set the stage. Before the Renaissance, during the Middle Ages, these classical myths were often viewed through a very specific Christian lens. The Greek gods were sometimes seen as demons, or their stories were moralized to fit into Christian teachings. For example, the tale of Orpheus journeying to the underworld to rescue his wife Eurydice was often interpreted as an allegory for Christ's descent into hell to save humanity. It was a way of making these pagan stories safe and useful for a Christian society. But then, something changed. Starting in Italy, scholars and artists began to look back at the classical world, not as a source of cautionary tales, but as a golden age of human achievement, wisdom, and beauty. This movement, which we call humanism, placed a new emphasis on human potential and experience. Thinkers like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, scoured monasteries for lost men, unearthing works by authors like Homer, Virgil, and Ovid. It was Ovid's Metamorphoses in particular that became a kind of Bible for Renaissance artists and writers. This sprawling collection of myths, all centered around the theme of transformation, was a treasure trove of dramatic stories, complex characters, and vivid imagery. The tales of gods falling in love with mortals, heroes battling monsters, and people being turned into trees or stars fired up the Renaissance imagination. So, how exactly did Renaissance writers adapt these myths? Well, it wasn't just a simple copy and paste job. They wove these ancient stories into their own works to explore contemporary themes. Take William Shakespeare, for example. His plays are absolutely packed with classical allusions. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the entire subplot of Pyramus and Thisbe, a tragic story of two lovers from Ovid, is performed as a hilariously bad play. Shakespeare uses this myth not just for comedy, but also to mirror the romantic entanglements and misunderstandings of the main characters. In The Winter's Tale, the statue of the Queen Hermione miraculously coming to life at the end is a direct nod to the myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who fell in love with his own ivory statue, which the goddess Venus then brought to life. For Shakespeare, this mythological reference adds a layer of magic and the power of art to bring about reconciliation and rebirth. Key themes in the play. It wasn't just in England. In Italy, poets used myth to explore the complexities of love and desire. Angelo Polizianoesi stands per la giostra beautifully retells the birth of Venus, a scene that famously inspired Botticelli's iconic painting. Here, the myth isn't a moral allegory. It's a celebration of beauty, love, and the creative spirit of the Florentine court. The classical world provided a new, richer vocabulary to talk about human emotions. But the adaptations weren't always celebratory. Sometimes, myths were used to critique power and society. In Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Fairy Queen, an allegorical work praising Queen Elizabeth I, the mythical figures and monsters the knights encounter often represent real-world political and religious threats. The terrifying dragon, Error, is a tangle of classical and Christian imagery, representing the perceived dangers of Catholic propaganda by dressing up contemporary issues in the grand costume of myth and legend. Writers could comment on their world in a way that was both epic and surprisingly subtle. Another fascinating aspect is how Renaissance writers personalized the myths. They weren't just retelling the stories, they were entering into a dialogue with them. When Christopher Marlowe writes about Leander swimming the Hellespont to meet his lover, Hero, in Hero and Leander, he does so with a sensuousness and psychological depth that feels startlingly modern. He's less interested in the moral of the story and more interested in the raw, passionate experience of the characters. He's taking Ovid's framework and using it to explore his own poetic and philosophical concerns. This adaptation process also involved the fusion of classical and Christian ideas. The Renaissance wasn't a rejection of Christianity, it was a synthesis. Take John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is arguably the pinnacle of this tradition. It's the Christian story of the fall of man, but Milton tells it using the structure and style of a classical epic like the Iliad or the Aeneid. He invokes a muse, features epic battles in heaven, and gives Satan the complex, tragic grandeur of a Homeric hero. By blending these two traditions, Milton elevated his Christian subject matter, giving it a universal, timeless power. He showed that the epic scope and psychological depth of Greek literature could be used to explore the most profound questions of Christian theology. So, the Renaissance love affair with Greek myths was a dynamic and creative process. It was a rediscovery, but also a reinvention. These ancient stories provided a framework for exploring everything from the nature of love and beauty to political intrigue and a person-s relationship with God. The gods and heroes of Olympus were brought down to earth, made more human, more relatable, and more relevant to the people of the Renaissance. They weren't just distant figures from a pagan past. They became powerful symbols for understanding the human condition itself. This incredible fusion of the ancient and the modern is why these stories continue to resonate. The Renaissance built a bridge from the classical world to our own, ensuring that the Thales of Icarus's ambition, Narcissus's self-love, and Prometheus's defiance would continue to inspire caution and fascinate us for centuries to come. The next time you see a reference to a Greek myth in a movie or a book, remember the Renaissance artists and writers who dusted off these ancient tales and made them shine for a new age. What do you think of when you hear the word honor? Maybe it's about being honest, keeping your word, or having a good reputation. Now, we often see honor as a personal quality, something internal. But what if I told you that a few hundred years ago, honor was something completely different? It was public, it was fragile, and people would literally die for it. We're journeying back to the Renaissance, from the 14th to the 17th century, to explore the fascinating and often brutal concept of honor as it appears in the literature of the time. This isn't just an abstract idea, it was the social currency of the era, dictating everything from who you could marry to how you were expected to behave in public. So, what was Renaissance honor? For the aristocracy, it was a public spectacle. It was your reputation, your family's name, your social standing, all rolled into one. It was something you were born with, tied directly to your lineage and your bloodline. But here's the catch. While you inherited it, you had to constantly defend it. An insult, a rumor, even a sideways glance could tarnish your honor. and the consequences were severe. Think about Shakespeare's plays. In Romeo and Juliet, the whole tragedy kicks off because of a feud between two families, the Montagues and the Capulets. This isn't just a petty squabble, it's about the honor of my kin. Tybalt feels his family's honor is stained simply by a Montague showing up at their party. His reaction immediate, violent, and ultimately fatal. He challenges Romeo, not just out of personal anger, but to restore the public image of his family. This demonstrates a key aspect of masculine honor. It demanded a swift and often public defense against any perceived slight. Your worth as a man was measured by your readiness to fight. This brings us to the duel. The duel was the ultimate courtroom for matters of honor. If someone insulted you, you could challenge them to a fight to the death. The logic was that God would favor the truthful and honorable man, granting him victory. It was a deadly, serious business. In Hamlet, the final scene revolves around a duel between Hamlet and Lear. While this particular duel is rigged and part of a larger revenge plot, it highlights how dueling was a socially accepted, almost expected, way to resolve conflicts of honor among noblemen. It was a performance, a public testament to one's courage and commitment to one's name. But what about women? Did they have honor? Absolutely. But it was defined in a completely different and frankly much more restrictive way. For a woman, honor was almost entirely synonymous with her chastity. A woman's virtue was her most valuable asset, and it wasn't even truly her own. It belonged to her family first, her father, then her husband. Her sexual purity directly reflected on the honor of the men in her life. Let's look at another Shakespearean tragedy. Othello. Desdemona is the perfect example of this. Her honor is her faithfulness to her husband. The entire tragedy is driven by Iago's evil whispers, planting seeds of doubt about her fidelity. Just the suspicion of her being unchaste is enough to destroy her reputation and, ultimately, her life. Othello feels his own honor has been destroyed because he believes his wife has been unfaithful. He says his name, that was as fresh as Dion's visage, is now begrimed and black as mine own face. He feels he has no choice but to kill her, to cleanse his honor. It is a brutal and horrifying illustration of how female honor was both incredibly fragile and policed by men. A man could lose his honor on the battlefield or in a duel, but he could also lose it in the bedroom through the perceived actions of his wife. Beyond Shakespeare, we see this theme everywhere. In Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Faerie Queene, knights embark on dangerous quests in the name of honor. They fight monsters and sorcerers to prove their virtue and win the favor of a noble lady. Their entire identity is built around a chivalric code where honor, bravery, and piety are intertwined. These knights are the idealized versions of the Renaissance gentlemen, constantly striving to prove their worth through noble deeds. Their honor is an active, questing force. We also see the complexities of honor in works like Miguel de Don Quixote. Don Quixote is a man obsessed with an outdated, fictionalized version of knightly honor. He sees insults where there are none and fights windmills thinking they are giants, all in the name of his lady, Dulcinea. Cervantes uses this character to satirize the extreme and often absurd lengths to which people would go for honor. He questions whether honor is an inherent truth or just a story we tell ourselves. Is Don Quixote honorable, or is he just mad? The book brilliantly plays with this ambiguity, showing how the pursuit of an abstract ideal can clash with the messy reality of the world. So, honor in the Renaissance was a powerful double-edged sword. For men, it was a public badge of status that demanded constant, often violent, self-defense. It was tied to their lineage, their courage, and their ability to control the women in their family. For women, it was a cage, a single standard of sexual purity that determined their entire value to society. This concept shaped the plots of countless stories, driving characters to acts of incredible bravery, passionate love, and devastating violence. It created the dramatic tension in plays and the epic scale of poems. Understanding this specific historical definition of honor is like having a key that unlocks a deeper level of meaning in Renaissance literature. It helps us see that these stories aren't just about timeless themes of love and revenge. They are also a product of a very specific time and place. A world where your reputation wasn't just part of your life, it was your life. The next time you read a Renaissance play or poem, pay attention to every mention of honor, name, and reputation. Ask yourself, whose honor is at stake? How are they defending it? And what does that tell us about the values of their world? It adds a whole new layer to these incredible works of art. Now, we're journeying back in time to the Renaissance, an era of incredible rebirth in art, science, and thought. But what was the engine that powered this explosion of knowledge? It wasn't a king or a conqueror, but an invention that literally changed the world one page at a time. The printing press. Before the mid-5th century, books were a luxury few could afford. Each one was painstakingly copied by hand, a process that could take months, even years. These manuscripts, often written in Latin and secured in monasteries, were accessible only to a tiny elite of clergy and nobles. The vast majority of people lived in a world without widespread written words. Information traveled by word of mouth, and literacy was an almost mythical skill. This all began to change around 1440 in Mainz, Germany. A goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg had a revolutionary idea. He combined existing technologies like the wine press and block printing with his own invention. Movable metal type by creating individual letters and symbols that could be arranged and rearranged. He could print pages far faster and more cheaply than any scribe. His first major project, the Gutenberg Bible, was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and a testament to the power of his new machine. Suddenly, the ability to replicate text wasn't limited by the speed of a human hand. It was limited only by the speed of the press. This was the spark that would ignite a revolution in communication. The impact was immediate and profound as printing presses spread like wildfire across Europe. The cost of books plummeted. What was once a treasured object, as valuable as a small farm, became accessible to the growing middle class of merchants and artisans. For the first time, you didn't have to be a monk or a lord to own a book. This newfound accessibility fueled a hunger for knowledge that had been lying dormant for centuries. People wanted to read, and for the first time, they had something to read. This created a powerful feedback loop. More books led to more readers, and more readers demanded even more books. One of the most significant changes was the shift away from Latin. While early printers continued to produce religious texts in the language of the church, they quickly realized there was a massive, untapped market for works in the vernacular, the everyday languages. People actually spoke, like Italian, German, French, and English. Authors like Dante and Chaucer, who had already chosen to write in their native tongues, found their works reaching audiences they could never have dreamed of. This legitimized and standardized local languages, helping to shape the national identities we know today. People began to see their own language, their own culture, reflected in print. The printing press didn't just make more books, It made information more reliable. When books were copied by hand, errors were inevitable. A tired scribe might skip a line, misspell a word, or even add their own thoughts. Over generations of copying, a text could become significantly altered from its original version. Printing, however, allowed for the creation of thousands of identical copies from a single master set of type. An anatomist in Padua could be certain he was looking at the exact same diagram as a colleague in Paris. A navigator in Lisbon could trust that his printed star charts were the same as those used by sailors in Amsterdam. This standardization was crucial for the scientific revolution, as it allowed scholars across Europe to build upon a common, verified body of knowledge. This wave of information directly challenged established authorities, most notably the Catholic Church. For centuries, the Church had been the primary gatekeeper of information and its interpretation. But now, thinkers like Martin Luther could print their ideas and distribute them far and wide. His 95 Theses, which criticized certain church practices, were printed and spread across Germany in a matter of weeks. The Protestant Reformation was, in many ways, the first major movement powered by mass media. People could read the Bible for themselves in their own language and form their own interpretations. This shift in power from the institution to the individual was a defining characteristic of the Renaissance. The explosion of printing also gave rise to entirely new forms of literature and new careers. The professional author, who could make a living from selling their books to a wide public, became a reality. Almanacs, pamphlets, and newsletters, the precursors to our modern newspapers, brought news and practical information to a broad audience. Literacy rates, while still low by modern standards, began a steady climb. With this came a rise in critical thinking. When people could compare different texts and different points of view, they were encouraged to question, analyze, and form their own opinions. The world of ideas was no longer a one-way street from the pulpit. It was becoming a bustling, multi-lane highway. Education was fundamentally transformed. Universities, which had previously relied on a small collection of manuscripts, could now build vast libraries. Students no longer had to simply listen to a master read from a single text. They could have their own copies to study, annotate, and debate. This accelerated the pace of learning and research, laying the groundwork for the Enlightenment and the modern scientific method. The humanist ideal of a well-rounded, educated individual became an achievable goal for a much larger segment of the population, not just the privileged few. Think about the sheer scale of this change. In the 50 years after Gutenberg's invention, an estimated 20 million books were printed. In the century that followed, that number soared to around 200 million. It was an information explosion on a scale the world had never seen. This flood of printed material rewired European society, breaking down old hierarchies and creating new networks of communication. It fostered a sense of shared knowledge and culture that transcended local communities and even national borders. The Republic of Letters, a long-distance community of scholars and thinkers, could now correspond and debate with unprecedented speed and clarity. In essence, the printing press was the internet of its time. It democratized information, empowered individuals, and connected the world in a way that was previously unimaginable. It fueled the artistic brilliance of the High Renaissance, the daring voyages of the Age of Discovery, and the profound religious and political shifts of the Reformation. By expanding the ability to read and write, it fundamentally altered how humans learned, thought, and communicated. The Renaissance was a time of looking back to the classical world for inspiration, but it was the forward-looking technology of printing that propelled its ideas into the future. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with a sword, but with a word. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories about how we became who we are today.